am um I would start by saying I am a lot of great things. I am a runner, I am a daughter, sister, best friend, girlfriend, you name it. And I'm very community oriented. So I really like to name those roles first. And I'm also currently studying for a master's in school counseling at NYU. So this topic, when Shimona presented it, it was a really great opportunity because it coincides with what I'm currently learning, what I'm currently thinking about as I'm learning, especially as it relates to trauma. And in my coursework this week, I'm learning about intergenerational trauma and even the whole concept of that. So I just bring the knowledge that I'm currently learning and also where I'm currently at in that mental health journey as it relates to supporting communities and also myself.
Thank you, Danixa. So, um, so when you hear the term intergenerational trauma, like I had spoke allude to it by saying like passed on from generation to generation. What exactly does that mean to you? Like, can you unpack a little bit about what I said about intergenerational trauma and how far back it can go?
Sure. And I'll start with the word intergenerational. So it's trauma that has been passed down from different generations. So that would be a maternal grandmother to mother to the individual. And what it simply means is that is trauma, and it's not specific trauma because families go through and individuals go through their own unique trauma and also reactions to that, but it's just simply the nature of trauma passed down from at least two different generations.
Okay. And so is there any like from your own experience, do you have any unique um experiences with the idea of intergenerational trauma that you can identify within your own um family or within your own lineage?
Yeah, and that's something that I've been meaning to unpack, particularly because there was a presentation in my class about 2 weeks ago in which they had used the genogram, and I believe the therapy is Bowenian family therapy, in which you analyze who's in relation to who, and there are certain lines and certain marks that indicate the type of relationship, and there's also information written on the side. And when I saw one of my fellow students complete it, it made me think about my own relationships as it concerns what patterns am I repeating, because sometimes it's easy to go, okay, well, my grandmother or my mom did this, but I think for more accountability, I'm thinking about, well, what patterns am I still repeating? And that's a question that I'm still answering as far as really examining relationships, not only in, and I'm talking in terms of systems, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but I'm thinking in terms of like my own family subsystem, meaning just the unit, just the small unit. So for me, it's my mom, my brother, and myself, and also people who exist outside of it, whether it's, for example, my niece's mother, or whether it's people on my niece's mom's side of the family, and just thinking about those patterns and layers of interaction, and also just seeing, what is my role, and also how might I be playing into other, I guess, intergenerational forces as it concerns with trauma. So I think one thing I would think about in that example, and like I said, I'm still in the process of answering this question, is what processes am I continuing? And then that can only be done by just further going into the past and exploring those different relationships.
Absolutely. So when I was reading about intergenerational trauma, there was a lot of emphasis on the mother's role in intergenerational trauma, like how is the mother, the grandmother, or the maternal effects or impact on generation to generation. Do you feel there is an equal responsibility on the paternal lineage of intergenerational trauma?
Of course, I think the emphasis that's placed solely on the mother really began, I think, with an era in psychotherapy that wasn't informed by the women's movement and also the roles that women occupy as well. So I do think that, yes, both sides are equally as responsible because it takes two people to create a life. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, women are the ones sustaining that life and carrying that life for 9 months, but men also have a part to play too. And I think that might be, I mean, it might be something to unravel within the community, as in why aren't men holding other men accountable in terms of intergenerational, and I'll use the word interpersonal trauma, because a lot of times a lot of the interpersonal relationships do cause trauma in terms of not, and I hate to use that word loosely because we are using it a lot, but I would more say like conflicts. And then sometimes those prolonged conflicts can turn into trauma. And where you see it, I think, manifests as trauma, as in the case of two people get together, they have a child, and this is not standard in every case, and this is not standard for every guy, but in the example of the father leaving, and
Mm-hmm.
then what that absence and what that void is creating in that child, and also how their family relationships are disrupted, because a lot of where we get our, how we relate to one another, how we relate to different people, I think is intimately tied to how well we first relate to our first caregivers, which were our mom and our dad. And depending on how we interacted with them and how they responded to us, really dictates how we go about in life as far as how we just respond to other people. So I think back to the original question, we have to make sure that we hold men as responsible, because they are equally as responsible in perhaps facilitating or passing down that intergenerational conflict.
Awesome. So one other thing, like as you spoke, that a question that triggered me is is the impact the same if the parent is absent? Like, so we know that the parent is present, they're bringing their trauma, they're bringing their generational trauma. So they're bringing from the grandmother, the grandfather, they're bringing from the mother, the father into their parenting, right? Um, could an absentee parent's trauma also impact that lineage? Like, do we see that as an indicator, like without even having, like, maybe the child doesn't know the mother or have a relationship with the mother, or doesn't have a relationship with the father, has no connection to that genealogy in any way or that side of their family, could that trauma still then impact that child?
I think you can find commonalities. And I think with that child, it's based on who their primary caregiver is. So if there is, I would say if there isn't a mother present, who the person who is filling in for that mother role really will impact whether that child might face similar obstacles as the absentee parent. Because if that caregiver is able to step in and provide a safe, predictable, and nurturing and consistent environment, then it would lessen the effects, because that child would have an outlet through who they can express their feelings or who can help them process their feelings. But if that caregiver is either as worse or as absent, then you might be able to see some commonalities. And one thing I want to insert here is the concept of resiliency, and that looks different for other people. And it also means that if people don't have that same level of resiliency, it doesn't mean that they're worthless or they're not tough enough. It's just that
Mhm.
their threshold is perhaps different. So that also comes into play too, because I've spoken to individuals who've had those type of issues in terms of a caregiver was absent for an extended period of time and then came back into their life. But they mentioned to me that they had other coping strategies that helped them to either put a positive spin and also to damage that psychological impact, because like with our minds, they're so amazing that we try to do everything we can to protect our mental state and also from anything that hurts us. So we'll create anything to um to cope through that situation. And for some people, they're able to cope effectively. And then for others, it's just too much of a burden to bear.
Yeah. So personal story. So I look at intergenerational trauma in two ways. So when I look at myself, right? My grandmother, she suffered from alcoholism. Didn't really know her, so I can't really give you much about her life. My great grandmother.
You on a different path. That's
Can
about
we
it.
mute ourselves, please? Um, so my grandmother, I didn't really know much about her, but I did know
You know
that she
already.
struggled.
You know that.
Legit, Joe. Oh, they go about. Oh,
Jessica,
Lena,
Joe, somebody decided to see you. Yeah, so my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she like I said, I didn't really know her, but I've heard stories that she had struggled with alcohol. And my great grandmother didn't know nothing about her, you know. But then my mom, then, she didn't struggle with alcoholism, but she was a drinker. I, however, don't like to drink. My son, maybe occasionally, not really interested. And so it's like, that's what I'm like, is it like, is it subjective? Is it nature versus nurture? And is it just like when you intentionally see, are aware of some of the generational traumas or generational norms, and you start to intentionally like change them, does that have impact on how your lineage change and shift? Then I look at my son's father, like his paternal side of his family, where his great grandfather was an alcoholic. His great grandfather was an alcoholic. His grandfather struggled with alcohol and substance abuse. His father is now struggling with substance abuse, but again, he is not. So it's like, it's back to that question of nature versus nurture. And does the intergenerational trauma have to be something that is intentionally shifted, or is it something that's inevitable?
I think it has to be intentionally shifted based on what I'm reading so far, because there have been some literature out there that mentions the impact of what's called adverse childhood experiences, called ACEs for short, and how that changes the brain's chemical structure. In certain cases, from what I've read, if someone is subjected to a repeated, prolonged periods of stress without either any ways of coping, they'll still find a way to cope.
Mhm.
And in certain instances, those genes are passed on down onto offspring. And
Mhm.
then I've or kids. I I don't want to sound too scientific. I've been in the weeds today with reading, but but then you also have a scenario in the brain, and this is why I kind of like the neuroscience portion of psychology, but not too much, because there's a concept called neuroplasticity. And that, for example, let's say, and to your example, right, someone's coming from a lineage with alcoholism, and then one person intentionally decided to say, that that's not a coping strategy I want to engage in.
Mhm.
And I say that because I never want to, demonize or put anyone down for having that affliction, because
Mhm.
sometimes, the world we live in, it can be pretty, it can be pretty tough. But for some people, when you make that conscious choice, and provided that you have love and you have a supportive environment to foster that change, you can actually turn that into a different outcome. And there are other things, and like I said, at play other than the intention. It's the environment and also the willpower of that person, and it can change how um, that is passed down, because in some family therapy systems, if change is even accomplished in one person, it will have a ripple effect in the family. So if there's children involved, the direct descendants will be different, because what we do as humans, but we do what other species do. We pass on our genes and we pass on our cheat codes to the next generation for survival, so that they can survive and adapt. And by taking a different and positive outcome, you can dramatically alter the trajectory of your family, and also in certain ways heal those intergenerational traumas. Because I think sometimes what's absent in that conversation is, how do we move from that to a place or a position of resiliency?
And so I also read that intergenerational trauma can also be connected to a culture. So in addition to our familial intergenerational traumas, we also have cultural intergenerational traumas. So the question is like, do you feel like, let me get it right. Why do you think there's an important consideration or emphasis mostly on intergenerational trauma when caring for people of color? Because it's very saturated in the conversation of intergenerational trauma when it comes to people of color, like, when it comes to slavery or Jim Crow and all the other cultural traumas that people of color have gone through, right? The article I read also talks about the Holocaust and generational trauma of that culture of individuals. Why do you think that this idea that, okay, because of these like very public, very violent traumas, that the emphasis of intergenerational trauma is focused on these groups and not on other groups? And do you think that there are intergenerational traumas amongst other groups, even though they didn't have the same type of violent traumas culturally as those of minority and the Hasidic community?
I definitely believe that it can be applied to all groups, but
Mhm.
in that it's very specific. I think sometimes part of the problem with Western notions of mental health is that we must find either one justification or one group to fit a specific definition, when that can be applied across different cultures, and it looks differently even within certain groups of color. So for example, with the African diaspora, going back to my earliest position on how genes can be coded to pass down the lessons learned, it's the same thing that operates in this scenario, and that within the different groups of the diaspora and the different areas, the enslaved people passed down what they knew or what they tried to do to survive onto their kids. And also that memory and that legacy is not only imparted because of how systemic it was and what people needed to do to survive within that system. So again, going back to human survival, you want your offspring, you want your kids to succeed and to survive. So for example, within the African diaspora in the Western hemisphere, they passed on certain ways to survive as well. And similarly with the Holocaust, people passed down the information that they knew and that kept them and that kept their descendants alive, but they also might have passed down some of the phobias because they were under such a persistent and such a constant threat that it literally changed some of the makeup of their cells and also of their brain chemistry. I think when we focus it on two groups, though, it can be problematic because then you wind up fostering a culture of pity towards those groups. And I would say, in particular, with the African diaspora, because what people don't need is pity. What people really need is the system to be accountable. And I think we're having these conversations because the American empire, for all intents and purposes, is facing its sins of the past. And the only way that you can do that is to acknowledge the harm that you've done to particular communities, in particular, I would say, in this continent, the African and also the native populations. But I think the conversation is incomplete without mentioning economics and how that kind of heaped more onto the plate as far as the suffering of people of color. And I think we'll get to a point where we can even start talking about the greater impacts when, I don't know, I would say when more things happen to this country that force it to reckon with its past. But I think other groups can have intergenerational trauma as well, because, for example, if you look at Central and South America, you've had almost centuries of American and Western interference that interferes with people's ability to create self-sustaining communities, for them to feed themselves. And so the violence that's caused in those countries when people are fighting over resources or they're fighting over power can lead to trauma in individuals. But also, again, we have to look at how people are resilient, because you see examples, for example, in Sri Lanka, you have the Tamils and you have the government, in which they're still in a bitter fight. But prior to the 2000s, groups were able to coexist in a way, and they were able to manage the violence there in the country in a way that would kind of baffle people here, because they were like, well, you guys are constantly fighting, there's not that many resources, how come the violence doesn't spiral out of control? A lot of it has to do with the systems of coping. So back to the original question, each I believe each different group can experience intergenerational trauma, and based on where people fall within the global hierarchy, it really depends on specific factors. But there isn't, and there can't be just one definition just to encompass everybody.
Yeah, because personally, I feel like because we're like not addressing everyone, like everyone's intergenerational trauma, and we're not addressing like the individual stuff, not just like bullseyeing on one particular culture or race or subgroup. We miss out on our opportunity to create healing and true healing and understanding amongst all human beings, right? So then you have a group, a subset of a subculture of people who are in the process of healing. There's a bunch of programs to create healing. There's a bunch of conversations. There's a bunch of, history books. There's a bunch of novels and, all these different books about this particular culture and its trauma and its need for healing. In the meantime, what about the individuals that kind of like, were the opposers or the oppressors of this particular trauma, right? That in itself comes with a subset of trauma. Like, why is that so? Like, why did you feel the need to oppress? What was going on in your lineage? What were some of the traumas that created this, right? And so now you have one group trying to heal and the other group still trying to oppress. So the healing is not happening. It's like going in a cycle. It's like the wounds heal and then you bust them open again, the wounds heal, and then you bust them open again. So that's why I brought that question up, is like, because you hear it so much about, Black people and, people of color and, and, indigenous people and, Jewish people and the Holocaust. And you keep hearing about those same subset of people who have been traumatically, without a doubt, traumatically traumatized, but we're still trying to focus on that group and not really focus on the oppressors and why, in fact, they behave the way they behave, and if that has anything to do with intergenerational trauma. So now, thank you so much, Danixa, for all of your insight. Now I'm going to try to engage our audience and get some feedback from you all. Don't you all jump in all at once. But I do want to hear some of your feedback about what you've heard tonight. If anything triggered you, if anything came up, if you have any questions, now is the time. So you can unmute yourself when you like to speak. Any questions on the floor about intergenerational trauma? Even if it's like, what does it exactly mean, and how does it matter? How does it affect me? No questions?
Hey, Danixa. Hey, Shimona. Thank you guys for sharing. That was really great. No, I thought that was really really helpful information. And I would just say, I think there's like, in terms of what you guys are talking about, I see things in maybe there's like two ways, right? People who carry this trauma and continue to carry it, and those who try to break the cycle and try to break that trauma and not carry it on to the next generation. Do you all have any examples or recommendations on how not only to deal and manage with your own trauma that's been passed on from your family or from your generations before, but how to break that cycle and not pass that on to your children? Because I think, like, not only does it play out in like behaviors that hurt yourself, but it also plays out in like parenting behaviors, like beating your kids, like, right? If you think of you back in the days when slaves were beat, and it's something that we have carried on because it's the only way we learn how to discipline people, right? So any just examples or ways that you would encourage people to learn not only how to deal with their own trauma, but how not to pass that on to the next generation? Thanks.
I'll go first, and Danixa, you can go. For me, my biggest way and how I think of it and how I try to coach people that I talk to is transparency. You have to be open and honest with your kids. I've told my children some of the most ugly things that has happened to me, so they can see my resilience, right? They can see that bad things can happen in life. You don't have to fall, prey to it, and just because things happen to you doesn't mean that you need to inflict bad things onto other people. You can then show empathy and you can show humility to someone else in the midst of your pain. And, being open and honest with them, show them a different side, that there's no, because, what we've done generationally is we have told our children, I'm the adult, you're the child, I'm smarter, I'm stronger, I'm the boss, you're not. So they don't feel like they have a choice or a voice in a lot of decisions and conversations. So that kind of silenced them. So I think that transparency allowed a space for it to equalize and neutralize the space, so that the healing can not only come from me, but the education and knowledge can come from my children. So they make better decisions. My son is now a father. So I needed to prepare him, to build a healthy child. So if I kept secrets like, nothing ever happened to me, and because I beat you, you better not do nothing, like, no. It's like, yeah, stuff happened, And so now he has a real idea, a real understanding of what the world looks like. And he's not operating on mythical or lies or deception. He's going with honest, true, authentic knowledge about self and his lineage, so that he can move forward knowing the limitations, knowing the expectations, knowing the traumas, knowing what to expect. Okay, my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather all dealt with alcoholism. I need to keep an eye on that, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's real. When you said the secrets, when you talk about you keeping those family secrets, that's real. A lot of families do that. And what it does is it causes it to your history to repeat itself over and over and over. You know, like calling drugs. Oh, don't worry. He's just, Pop's just taking his medicine. You think of that as like, okay, that's all right. It's medicine. That's just part of what we do. And then next thing you know, you on that medicine, but as dealing with your own trauma. But that's real. Those family secrets, like, I guess that's one real way. It's like, don't keep secrets, right? Tell your kids everything. So at least they know better not to repeat those same mistakes. That's real. Thank you.
We told them stay in a child's place and not a grown folks' face.
Right.
But if you know it's wrong, why you doing it?
That's
and kids will tell you nowadays, well, it's wrong, why you doing it? Go ahead.
Hi, this is Sadiq.
Hi, Sadiq.
Hi. And, I remember growing up, they used to always say, don't be her, be seen, or
be seen, not heard.
Be seen, not heard. And that, speaking of how you pass on to your child not to feel like they have a place in the world and they can speak up for themselves, that right there has had a lot of, my generation, not speak up as they grew up in the world. You feel like it doesn't promote what's the word? It doesn't promote a sense of pride. It also doesn't help your child to communicate properly.
Yeah, they don't feel like they have full agency over themselves.
Right. They don't communicate fears, their needs, their wants, their dislikes, whatever. It just doesn't promote that. And I've noticed that in the generation after me, where kids are just like very outspoken now. They just say whatever. And I'm like, sheesh, I couldn't say that when I was growing up. Like, my head would have been spinning, but it's like a double-edged sword with that, but I think that if parents just teach the limits, limit their children on,
create boundaries,
say it and balance it out, the children will be okay, and you won't promote, adults, that don't know how to communicate, and hold everything in, and they take it out in a sense of violence, or they're very argumentative, or as they get older, they're just considered, introverted, and I think that comes a lot from just the way you were raised, that's a bad cycle. That's a bad generational cycle, because you have people in your family, like you said, they don't communicate. No one knows what's going on with them. No one, wants to take responsibility for certain things, or, just speak up, because everyone feels like they have to be quiet and stay in their place. And it's not like you have a place. It's just the way you say something. It's not having a place. Children have a place in certain adult conversations, because they need to know what's going on, like you said, and they need to be able to voice how they feel about certain things, because this world is a lot going on.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like, my daughter, she'll be 17 tomorrow. Joe, you're getting old. My daughter will be 17 tomorrow, and I told her the other day, because she had said something to me, and I just had to chuckle, because I'm like, I can't even right now, because her vocabulary is ridiculous. She be using words like I remember one time she told me, I told her, shut your mouth or something. I said, stop talking back or something like that. And she was like, are you trying to take away my freedom of speech? And I was like, wait, what? Like, what just happened? And I'm like, wait. And I had to take a moment to process that, because I'm like, wait a minute, this is a teachable moment for both of us. Am I gonna tell her that? Because now she's like challenging me, like, oh, I'm telling you my opinion about what's going on. I'm looking at it from my mom's perspective of I'm an adult, you're a child, don't back talk me.
Right.
But she's trying to state her position. I'm stating my position, but I don't want to hear her position anymore because I'm like, I'm the boss. I said what I said. That's it.
Right.
And she's like, well, so you telling me to shut up? So are you now telling me that you're going to take away my freedom of speech? And I was just like, floored. I was like,
yeah.
What happened in my house? What's going on? And she, in her vocabulary, she doesn't curse. She's not a disrespectful little girl, but she is very intentional and she's very stern. And it challenges me a lot because I get angry because I'm like, I'm used to the control and the power. And that's sometimes what parents kind of hold on to, the control and the power. And sometimes it's not about that. You have a power dynamic with your child. It's about two human beings, one older, one younger, of course, but that power dynamic shouldn't be like that. And what happens is, and this is how pedophiles prey on young children because of that power dynamic. They say, I'm older, you're smaller, or you're younger. I have the power, you don't, because I'm an adult and you're a child. So you are to do what I say do, right? Or you're in trouble. And so I never wanted to have my daughter think that way in life. I never wanted her to relinquish her power to anybody, no matter how old they were, because I know the mindset of a pedophile.
Right.
So yes, children today, but I'm just blessed to know that like she can communicate, because oh boy, does she.
That's a beautiful thing.
So like any more, so we have like 4 minutes left. We're almost at time. I still want to hear from some other people, like, when you think about intergenerational trauma, like what is coming up for you? What do you see? And you don't have to share a personal story, but just your idea about like how you've seen it play out in the world or in your community. Anybody?
Hello, I want to piggyback on what Sadiqa had said about when her generation, when she was young, when she hear these young kids saying, and that if she had to say it, her head be spinning or something like that. I want to piggyback on it because when they do say certain things and be disrespectful, not that my head would have been spinning back then, my head do spin just by hearing it, because it's like, wow, I just could feel that my mother is knocking me out for saying something like that, for being disrespectful. So I just feel I feel the spin. I feel the head spin when I hear somebody's being disrespectful. And it's sad because, and then sometimes when I see people or hear people being disrespectful, I just plead the blood of Jesus on them, because they know not what they're doing. But I like pull my grandkids away from that because I don't want them to suck that in. So I'm here listening to y'all, but I'm fighting a cold as well. But I'm hearing and I'm really enjoying it. But I just had to piggyback on that because you really touched it when you said that, Sadiqa. My head spins all around when I do hear people being disrespectful.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's sad. It's really, really sad.
Yeah, and Danixa and I did a youth program a couple of years ago, and we worked with young women ages, I think our youngest girls were 8 to about 15. And the first couple of times, now Danixa is very like soft spoken and a little reserved, but she's stern, like she ain't no punk. But she's a little bit more soft spoken than I am, and I had to work on my aggression, right? I wasn't like I'm gonna beat you down type of person, but I was a little bit more louder, and I was a little bit more straightforward. Like I would call you out. And when we would see the dynamic, because we wanted to go in this with humility and empathy, but I remember this one girl, she had like the biggest attitude, and it was a very simple exercise. We told them to go around the room and say one thing they were proud of this week, or one thing that great that happened to them this week. And everybody went around the room was like, oh, I'm so proud I got on the cheerleading team. One girl said, oh, I'm so happy, I passed my math test. And this one girl said, and I'm laughing. I'm not laughing because it was funny. I'm just laughing because of the boldness of her statement. She said, well, I'm proud that I didn't have to smack anybody this week, and I hope I don't have to today. And I was just like, what in the world? And I'm saying, like, what is, she ended up like coming to maybe one or two other sessions, but she ended up leaving. And her aunt was one of my volunteers. And her aunt brought her to the program. And she just had this anger. And, I'm not I'm justifying any of the children's behavior. But in regards to intergenerational trauma, which include poverty, which include sexual molestation, which include hunger, which include, drug addiction, which include so many different things, we're at a state where we haven't really, I think we're starting to open up to this. We really need to talk to our children and figure out what's going on, because there is a lot of anger.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of anger in their words, and we're hearing the words. We're not listening to the emotion that comes with the words.
That's true.
Right? We're looking at the action, but we're not looking and listening for the emotion that comes with the action. Like, we're seeing them, being more exploitative of themselves. We're seeing them be a little bit more defensive and, irritable. And that comes with anger. Like the gun violence that's going on. They're like, oh, kids are killing kids. We need to get the guns off the street. No, we need to get the anger off the street. And, Dro had brought up a good point, like, and we're at time, so if you all don't mind, if you have to go, that's fine. But because we got to this very sweet spot, Joe brought up a point of, like, what are some things we could do? Like I said, transparency, right? And that's what I do in my small space, right? That's in my home, in my immediate family. Does anybody else have any ideas? I know Nina's on the call. Nina has a program as well. But do we have any other ideas of how we begin to start to heal? And how do we start to uncover some of this and protect our current generation of children? Because they are the generation that's currently living and breathing. We have some that are just born, and we have some that's not born yet, that today we are responsible for protecting. Not to say that we ourselves don't still have healing, but we have an obligation and responsibility to protect those who are not here yet, those who just got here, and those who are going to be responsible for those who didn't get here yet, right? So what are some ideas do we have around some first steps we can take to so Nina said some non-judgmental conversations. Okay, go ahead.
If you're asking, like, on a bigger scale outside of the home, like, if people have organizations or going to establish one, maybe going into the schools and getting because that's something that I want to do. I want to get into the schools and get like a contract with the DOE, so I can bring my program in and talk to the youngins, get them at 3rd grade, 2nd grade, not in high school, junior high school. It's too late when they get that far. I'm not saying it's too late as in a sense like they're done, but I'm saying, like, we need to catch them early on, because it's a lot going on early on that's leading to the gun violence, and the sexual exploitation of the females of themselves. So if we could catch them young, because it's not always going to happen in the home, because like we're saying now, like, it's a lot of things going on in homes that we don't even know what's going on. Right. So if we could get them in the school and then try to bring the parent in, on the back end to because you always got to try to get the parent in, because you still do have to try to change the household if you can. But you know, if you could just get a little bit of that knowledge into the child's head in school, then or after school program, like things of that nature, like that's the way it's gonna happen, because the conversation has to be had, and it has to be had somewhere. And where can you catch them? In school.
Right. And you know, as you were speaking, Sadiq, I was like, you know, you remember when George Floyd was killed, we did a blackout of social media.
Right.
Like, why can't we do a blackout of social media in an effort to say social media, you know, like to black out social media, because it is one of the catalysts behind the pain and anguish that our teens are going through. Because
Right.
a lot of what they the bullying starts on social media that spills in the schools and spills in the community. So, you know, tackling it from multiple areas. So you're right. The getting them young. Nina said non-judgmental conversations and community groups. Sadiq said trying to get, you know, build different organizations to go in the schools and talk to the children. Some other ideas.
I would say to build on, I love the idea about the schools. I think one thing for me, I think is like anybody who has someone they could ever depend on for like love and care, right? And not every family has that, but the way intergenerational trauma plays out is eventually someone grows up and does not have anyone they can point to truly love or care for them. And then what happens with that child? My son, he was doing canvassing for me. He was actually doing it for a school. They were doing some student recruitment, and he knocked on a door, and a little girl answered. She had to be maybe 4 years old, and she answered the door, and she immediately hugged my son's leg. It was probably like 10:30 in the morning, and you know he was a little shook, and he was like, "Oh, what's going on?" And then finally the mom came to the door, and the mom was obviously, you know, he started saying his little pitch, and the mom was obviously like on heroin, doped up, and you could just see it in her face. She couldn't even really speak. Then a little boy, a little brother younger than the little girl, came to the door, and they were calling for the dad, who didn't even come. And the little girl was still holding on to my son's leg. Like, what happens to those kids when they're 13, 14 years old? Are they even in school? You know, and that's the thing I talk about is, say, love and care. Like, I believe once that's something like that is identified, I think the community, the government has to find a way to appoint someone to love and care for those kids and make sure that every day they got something to eat, that that family's in a drug program. You got to check on them daily, like an old person who cannot take care of themselves. Young people who can't take care of themselves, they need that, even if they have parents, because sometimes those parents, it's going to take, if they ever cure themselves of that intergenerational trauma, you know, they may not be able to, but they need something appointed someone to love and care for them.
But the other thing is, a lot of government programs are very how do you say it, band-aid-ish. So you have drug programs that focus on the drug problem, right?
Right.
And then, you know, they kind of give people a pass. Oh, you go to therapy after a certain amount of sessions. And because therapy is what you call it, voluntary. Yeah. What happens is a lot of people kind of like, they literally will yes the therapist to death to get through their 15-20 minutes of session, and then move on. And then the therapist checks the box, you know, and because they can't do nothing else, they came, they complied, they checked the box that they came, the person is out of the drug program, the family is back together, and as soon as they get a chance to, they go and start the problem again. So I think, you know, and I never, you know, when I got into mental health, and when I've been very active in my treatment, I was like, I never wanted to be like, oh, force mental health treatment on anybody. But in the recent years, like during the pandemic and during the last maybe 4 years, I was like, wait, something drastic needs to happen, something radical. And so I had this idea to push for a policy where a mental health evaluation is a part of our annual checkup. right? So at least some indicators can be identified annually. Now, given a lot of people don't go for the annual, but you know that children have to do it for school. A lot of people have to do it for work. So at least we're getting a majority of people that are either in our workforce, in our school system, student loans. If you want to get a student loan, and I know that the government has so much to do with our lives, our health, and our freedoms, and and that's why I was like always like dead set against it, like, oh no. But it's like, if we're gonna continue to have these types of consequences, like a 3-year-old kid was shot in the shoulder in Brownsville not too long ago. Like, what needs to happen for us to say, okay, we need to make drastic change, because there's something generational that happened there. Maybe there was something going on in the home. This child then ran to the streets, into the gangs. Now they have some type of beef that's going on. They shot. So many families were affected by this one generational traumatic experience that may not even have any blood connection. That kid could have been being hurt or molested by their neighbor. I have a friend who was getting molested by his babysitter from the age of 5 till he was 15. So it's, and like I said, I never really wanted to say, oh, let the government get involved in mental health compliance. But at this point, something needs to happen. I also said that about police officers. I think they need to get mental health evaluations monthly.
I think like on the governmental level, and this is just like my perspective, we could really cut down on a lot of the traumas if we just did basic things like universal health care, universal child care, livable wage. Because with all the resources that this country have and the trillions of dollars that this country have, there shouldn't be anybody hungry. There shouldn't be anybody homeless. There shouldn't be any inferior schools. And I think economics is part of it, because when you, for example, when I look at Far Rockaway, a community that I grew up in, partially, some of the conditions are still the same: lack of access to affordable jobs, lack of access to reliable infrastructure, and infrastructure meaning homes, infrastructure meaning workable systems. And then on top of that, if you don't have a car, you have to commute at least like an hour into the city or even into Brooklyn to find sustainable work. I think if we also acknowledge the government's also complicity in maintaining some of these crises, and also as a form of maybe reparations, is to offer and fund those services like the schools, like public health, so that we can reverse some of those outcomes. And I think also it starts with us adults. I think sometimes the kids act the way they do because they see us and they see how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, how we
How we
gossip
deal with
about each other.
conflict.
Right, how we deal with conflict. And because it's like we want them to be community oriented, but we're very individualistic. So they're already looking at us like, well, why should I even listen to you because you do X? Like, it was hard, for example, working in a high school because, yeah, I mean, you had a lot of externalizing behaviors, like kids lashing out. The hardest part was definitely saying something and living by what you said, because kids don't have that nuance to go, okay, well, there's a gray area. Their brains are still forming, so their logic is very black and white, like X has to equal Y. If you're saying, oh, share, cooperate, but you're doing the opposite, they're going to look at you like a fraud, and they're not going to take that action. So it's really, for me, just modeling it, and then also just holding our government accountable for the crises that are maintained in our communities.
Like, I see a lot of one of my pet peeves is when I hear about another shelter being built. I'm like, that same building that you're spending money to build a shelter can be a home or an apartment for a homeless family. One of my second pet peeves is that when I know that a family is living in a NYCHA housing and their income is like way beyond base. I have family members that are either police officers or correction officers or and been in for years. Pension is theirs, and will be still paying market rate in NYCHA. Now I get rent is high, but that apartment can go to a family and give them a fresh start because it go based on your income. If they have no income, then that's something that they can do. If you're gonna pay $1,800 rent in NYCHA, you can pay $1,800 rent somewhere else and give that family a chance to pay that, income-based rent in NYCHA and get a start. Something else I know in Virginia, they had a model where if you lived in public housing, they would put you on like a financial track. And when you first come in, they work with you to get a job. And then as your income increases, they kind of wean you off the public assistance. So you go from living in the public assistance houses to getting a house for Habitat, and they stay with you through the entire process. And so like in teaching you financial counseling, financial education, financial wealth, health. And so like incorporating that problem. So don't just take the family out the shelter, right? And give them an apartment and say, hey, well, good luck. Because I've seen it happen. It happened to me. I went into the shelter, got a voucher, and then after 2 years, they was like, good luck. And I'm like, I can only get a minimum wage job. That can't pay that $1,400 rent. What am I going to do now? Oh, I'm going to end up back in the shelter. I mean, I was a little bit more resourceful because I was an advocate and I was fighting and fighting and fighting. But in my fight, I found those resources. Nobody told me about it, but that was just me, my personal experience. But not the average. The average person didn't even know that, right? And so, like Danixa said, they kind of play a part in that because when you have these type of programs, and you don't really prepare for people for the what's next, the future. Okay, what's the 2-year plan? What's the 5-year plan? What's the 10-year plan? And work with them and provide resources based on their need at the time to help them move forward and give them real tangible goals. They're going to end up back in the shelter. The homeless community is going to continue to grow. So, this is amazing. Do we have any last remarks about this particular conversation? No last remarks? So a lot was said tonight. We talked about intergenerational trauma, where it comes from, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like. We talked about some ways that it impacted us and how it has impacted our community. We talked about some ways that we ourselves are looking forward and thinking of how things can change and how we can continue to make steps forward in changing and stopping the intergenerational traumas and how they impact our communities. So I have a call to action for you all. I want you to really think about how you're going to impact the community in the next 30 days. What is one way that you can contribute to this change, whether it's, really pushing through on building your organizations, or is it having a conversation with someone in a school to start some type of program, or whether it's having a conversation with your own family about some intergenerational traumas that may be in your family and how you guys can heal together. But the idea is to start one person at a time, one group at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, so that eventually we all can heal. I want to thank you all for coming on tonight. I do these chats every Monday at 8 p.m. They're on different topics, but we don't leave these Monday night chats with just a goodbye. We always have a call to action, but we always come back here and talk about next steps. Please share with me anything that you're doing that I can support, and I can share with the community of people that join the call. And with that, I bid you a good night, and I look forward to seeing you all next Monday. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks for joining. Good night, Sadiq.
Good night.
Good night, Pam. Good night, Keisha. Good night, Vance. Good night, Jessica.
Good night.
Good night, Nina.